Hello, well today it is my great pleasure and privilege to be interviewing for Perspectives from the Top Sir Mark Moody Stuart. Mark Moody Stuart is former Chairman and Chief Executive of Shell, a Director of HSBC, former Chairman of Saudi Aramco, former Director of Accenture, and many other senior corporate positions around the world. He's currently the Vice Chairman of the UN Global Compact and Chairman of the UN Global Compact Foundation. In addition, the author of an excellent book, Responsible Leadership, which looks at the importance of values, of integrity and sustainability in how we pull together business in our world. Mark, great privilege to have you here. Over the years that you have been a leader in organizations, you must have had a number of bosses that either inspired you or didn't necessarily inspire you that much. Tell me about those bosses that you really wanted to give your best for, that inspired you, and what they did on a day-to-day basis that made them so special.
I think built trust, basically. Trusted me and I trusted him. They were all hims, in fact. I think that's the relationship that you need, not right through the organization. I think building trust, mutual trust, is fundamental to any organization.
In terms of that sort of leadership that you experienced, how do you think organizations are doing in giving that to leaders who are currently in organizations, an inspiring place to work?
I think it's very varied. It's not possible to generalize without a lot of work. I think where that trust breaks down, it's fundamentally highly corrosive. If a company has values, all companies have values. If, for example, a company has a stated value, which most companies do, our value is respect for people, top value.
Yep.
And then they employ and promote managers who are brutal bullies and can reduce men and women to tears and don't do something about it, you might as well chuck the whole book out of the door. I mean, there was a terrible story I heard of a bank, I don't know which one, whose senior and most successful trader used to stand inside the front patio smoking. Everybody saw it. Nobody else was allowed to do it, but he was untouchable because he made a lot of money. You just chuck the whole values out of there. In my own experience, in Shell, for example, in the 90s, we were addressing industrial safety and discovered that in most cases they'd occurred either because someone had started an operation up before everything was ready, all training, in order to hit a deadline, or in some cases someone had known there was something not quite right, they'd felt uncomfortable but hadn't felt that they should really do anything about it. So we sent out a message, I sent out a message saying, look, don't start up unless you're ready, and anyone has the right, if they're uncomfortable, to stop the operation. But for 2 years after that, I thought, that's perfectly clear. For a couple of years after that, in town hall meetings, I would have people, at some point in the discussion with 100 people or so, stand up and say, Mark, aren't we still sending mixed signals about production versus safety? And initially I thought, well, this is ridiculous. It's in black and white there over my signature. And then I realized that what they were really saying was, do you really mean it, or are you just saying it because obviously it's true? But in the meantime, get on with the job. So we then had to work quite hard on finding occasions where someone had stopped it and making a big fuss about it and praising them, times when people could see that an act had cost the company money and yet they'd been praised, where the value had overridden financial considerations, and then people believe it. So a short-term cost is a very good demonstrator that values are working.
So how do you then ensure that that message about what's important gets down through the system from the board level without being effectively negated by the desire to earn money?
Well, I think you have to continually give examples. If you take corruption, you need what I call war stories, that you need cases. In Shell, for example, when we had the crisis in the middle of the 90s, we'd had really good business principles for 25, 30 years, devised by a tremendous man called Geoffrey Chandler, who was not at the top of the organization. They were very advanced. They had stakeholders. We didn't call them stakeholders, and so on. Those values were widely penetrated. If you said to someone, what are Shell's business principles? They said, quite easy, we don't bribe people and we don't get involved in politics. The we don't bribe people, they knew to be true because we had countless war stories of occasions where we'd lost contracts, been asked for bribes, said no. Everybody knew that was it. And they were able to say to someone asking for a bribe, you know, no offense meant, I can't give you a bribe, it's more than my job's worth, you know, I get fired if I do that. We don't do that. And after a while, people stop asking because they know. So that penetration is very important. When we had the Sarawak case, which was a human rights thing, we had not talked about human rights. Didn't mean we didn't do anything about it, but we didn't have the war stories about human rights. So if you said to someone, what's Shell's position on human rights? They didn't know, really. So we hadn't penetrated it. So the discussion of cases where operations were stopped, cases where bribes were not paid, cases where people were not promoted because they misbehaved in some way, are very important. So I think it's this continuous process of, well, what I call war stories, socialization of the examples. So people they know and can say with confidence, we don't do that. They could say in Shell, we do not bribe people, meaning we don't, because they felt part of the we.
Yeah.
In human rights, what we did was not clear. I think by now it is clear.
And therefore, it's through constant reinforcement of that consistent message that you get it through the system. And the boards that make a mistake are the ones that send out one great big message that says this is what we do, and then don't reinforce it for 18 months, 2 years, by which time everyone else has made up their own story and do their own thing.
No, and they think because it's on a set of things on everybody's wall that actually means something. And it doesn't unless you have examples for each one.
Yeah.
And that's where why in the UN Global Compact, where people commit to these 4 major areas of principles, human rights, environment, working conditions, and anti-corruption, an essential part is for the company to report on what they are doing about it. So not just we do it, but what are we doing? Are we doing it better this year? And if they don't do that, if they don't make this communication on progress, they are ejected.
So that's restating the war stories for that organisation.
Yeah.
And
it's
indeed for
encouraging
everybody
the organisation to develop its war stories.
Yeah. That's interesting. One of the things that I find interesting is in an organisation the size of Shell, there's evidence that perhaps up to 50% of profitability could now be down to people collaborating across silos to do more than their job, to contribute to the greater good of the organisation as well as doing their job. How have you found in your career and your perspective of how people should be breaking down silos and how you can make it work effectively?
It's very difficult because you have business lines,
Exactly.
and each of those business lines has its own profitability, and yet indeed you want cooperation. I think one of the ways of doing it is to have this matrix organization. Most organizations have a country regional matrix and a business line matrix. In the case of Shell, the country up to the 90s, the country regional matrix was the dominant one and the business was not. That introduced quite a lot of inefficiencies because you've got facilities replicated in multiple places. So we had far more kit. We had $50 billion more capital employed than Exxon, although we each produced the same profit. We beat them on most things except profitability on return on capital. If you want to address that, you have to redress the balance, but you have to try and do it, and I don't know that we were entirely successful, without throwing out what I call the pearl beyond price, which is the local feel. The feel that you can be in Malaysia or Japan and that you are part of the greater Shell, certainly part of your country organization. And it didn't matter whether you were in chemicals, exploration, production, or whatever.
And that I think is the challenge of any global organisation. The ability to have global consistency, global quality, however you wish to describe it, and be part of one global organisation, yet also feel and act local.
Yes, and every major organisation that I've come across struggles with this matrix. Yes. They all have matrices. Matrices are not easy to work with, particularly not for, and North Americans in particular don't like them because they think they're too complicated. But you actually need them, I think, to have the balance between the two. And you need a sort of pendulum. First it swings one way, one side begins to dominate, and then you need to swim back, which is why occasionally you need to change the chief executive.
Yeah, which is that inevitable pendulum effect, that transition between centralisation and decentralisation that all organisations are going through cyclically throughout their entire existence.
Exactly.
And I'd absolutely agree. Everything you said there, and you know HSBC and the financial services world, it is exactly that challenge. But what I find interesting about that is that in the end, to make that work, you need flexible and adaptable leaders. Over recent years, with cuts in organisational costs, etc., many organisations have cut back on training budgets. Do you think that we actually have enough leaders in our organisations to be able to inspire people? Are they being given the right training, or have we cut back too much and need to reinvest in developing leaders in our organisations?
I don't know whether it's, I don't have the data to say whether it's got better or worse. I mean, one of the problems we have in business, we tend always to think that our current situation that it's more difficult than our predecessors had to deal with. And of course things have changed. Communication is much faster. If something happens, everybody knows about it. I go back to when I joined Shell, you know, it could be a couple of weeks before any, I mean, we had telexes, but it was slow stuff. So I think the speed of reaction and the transparency makes it more difficult, but it's quite difficult to, I mean, I think you need to focus training on that. When business schools ask me, which I get asked occasionally, you know, what is the most important thing we should teach? I always say, well, you do analysis very well and all of that stuff. What you don't hammer into people is the need to talk, to communicate externally, to engage with people, including people who are your critics, who do not agree with you, who perhaps think you should cease to exist, who you may secretly think are stupid, and they probably are not. They actually bring something different and reminds you of what's happening in the outside world and allows you to adapt to your organization and take those things into account. So you're thinking, you're not just talking about stakeholders, you're actually engaging with them and listening to what they genuinely listening, not just telling them what you're doing and saying, are you happy with that? But actually listening. And a lot of the progress that's been made has been through this cooperation between civil society organizations and businesses, where one party, normally civil society, raises a problem. Could be on traded goods, it could be on corruption, could be on all sorts of things, medicines, says, look, there's a problem. Business's reaction initially is, yeah, there's a problem, but it's the government's problem, not our problem. It's not a very big problem. And then eventually some company sits down and says, okay, let's talk about it. And out of that come groupings of companies and civil society who actually achieve real progress on quite narrow fronts, on corruption, on environmental things, biodiversity, diversity, by addressing, so you have sort of growing learning points, which is voluntary, like the Global Compact.
But I think that's an interesting point. So that there is a leadership lesson there, which is valid, which says, if you're a leader, there's no point going out, and it doesn't matter whether you're working internally or externally. If you're a leader, there's no point going out and asking the people who you know are going to agree with you whether they agree with you, because it's obviously they're going to. And I've said to young leaders, actually the people you should be talking to are the people who are criticising you and disagreeing with you. And my view is that that's equally valid internally as externally, because it can help break down the silos. But to the external point, if we look at understanding, therefore, the bigger picture outside organisations, do you think that organisations should be more like, for example, entrepreneurs and SMEs, where what happens is that entrepreneurs have to look outside because they have to understand what's happening in the world to be able to service their customers, whereas the larger organisation doesn't necessarily have to do that?
Yes, but I'm always quick to add that leaders of large organizations are very often not entrepreneurs. I mean, we are functionaries, and I include myself. I did not put my house, my mortgage, my everything. I put my life into it and my family's life, but I was not betting my whole livelihood on it and creating ab initio. I think we did some entrepreneurial things, but a real entrepreneur normally doesn't work in one of those organizations because they don't like it. They want to do what they want to do. And that's an interesting thing. I remember someone from once in the latter days of the Soviet Union talking to a senior person in Gazprom, and they were fascinated by Shell and wanted to learn how in the transition glasnost they could change things. And his name was Rezunenko, and I was sitting next to him on a plane, and he said, "Mr. Moody, Stuart, how do you deal with dissent in Shell?" Very good question. I had to think, and the answer is, well, I expect a young engineer to argue with me and say, surely, that's not a very good idea, but there comes a point, of course, when you've decided everything, when it's no longer acceptable for the young engineer to say, well, I never agreed with that in the first place. I always thought it was a stupid idea, because we'd arrived after much consideration, for better or worse, with going in a direction. Doesn't mean that you can't subsequently question the direction, but you have to be committed to it at a certain.
And that then brings us back to your initial thoughts around leadership and things going wrong, and people having the courage and ability, if they see things that might be happening that are going wrong or against the values of the organisation, that they feel safe in speaking up.
Absolutely, yeah, absolutely.
Because that otherwise, then you are effectively going straight down a path to disaster, with the people at the top thinking everything's fine and the people at the bottom thinking the people at the top don't care that things are going off the rails. So, and if we, just to sort of pull it together, what would be your one or two pieces of key advice to a young developing leader about how they can be an effective leader and achieve their goals and indeed develop their career?
I think building trust through openness, clearly working in a team, because we work in teams, and each team member brings his or her own expertise and then learns from the other members of the team their expertises, and then progresses up the organization. I think building trust so that people know when you say you're going to do something, you do it, and that you're doing it for the team and not just for you. I think it's extremely important at higher levels for business people to consider their role. None of this can be done by business alone, can't be done by governments alone. You have to work together, and that means business, in alliance with civil society, has to work with government to take off your corporate hat and say, okay, now what are the economically rational things that need to be done to create? If you take climate and energy, what do we actually collectively need to do? And what we tend to do is we throw rocks at each other, and someone says it's all the oil companies' fault because they produce the stuff. Well, who burns the stuff? It's the rest of society. And the oil companies tend to say, well, we are fulfilling essential demand, and without us, you'd be in stock. What we need to do is say, what do we need to do to allow the market and competition to operate, but to set up frameworks which guide the market. I'm a passionate believer in the market, but the market will not deliver everything. It will not deliver things which do not supply immediate benefit to the consumer in his or her choice. He or she may be aware that it's in the benefit of society as a whole, perhaps, and therefore him or her as well, but it's not actually of immediate benefit when they put their hand in their pocket. So you need frameworks to guide the market in the right direction, but which don't tie the market's hand. And it's very important that people throughout an organization recognize that regulation, sensible regulation to guide the market, is there for a societal purpose, and we really need it. You don't know how much, people who say we don't believe in government, they should try living in a country without a government.
And that is interesting, because what you set out there in terms of the sort of macro perspective, I think is happening much more on the micro perspective, because if I look at what young leaders and indeed employees who are entering the workforce now expect from an organisation, is actually slightly different to what we might have expected. It's no longer, as long as this organisation delivers shareholder return, that's fine. Many young people are now asking the question, well, hang on, yeah, that's great, but what is the purpose of the organisation? Are we in a position where organisations need to be much more clear about the fact that they do have a purpose that is greater than just making money? Because that's what both society and employees now expect.
No, I think, but I don't think that has changed, really. When I joined Shell as a geologist, when I was a young boy, my father said to me, what would you like to, what are you going to do with your life? And I said, well, I'd like to be a sugar planter just like you. And he said, forget it, it's over. Go find something else useful to do. And I thought I'd found something useful to do. Here we were, taking some of the Earth's resources, converting them, supplying energy to the world. That, to me, whether it's a noble purpose, it's certainly useful. I tend to remove the word noble. I think it's doing something useful, worthwhile, that you really feel is a contribution to, is a meeting a need. And I think that's been there all along. And if you don't have that in an organization, and it was certainly there, when I joined the company, that was, we were doing a useful job. Now, in order to do a useful job, you had to make money, and part of the fun was doing it better and so on. But It's fundamentally useful. So one of the things I say to people is think about, do you think that the industry, business that you're going into is doing a useful job? Now, you know, I'm not an advertiser myself. I'm not an advertising person, but you will hear advertisers passionately believe that they are actually offering choice and clarification. They need to hang on to that, because sometimes they don't, of course. But nonetheless, I, as a geologist, admit that, you know, advertisement has a useful social purpose. It's information, etc. So I think you need to question yourself as an individual.
Yes.
Is what I'm doing useful?
And it's that combination, I think, of questioning yourself,
Yeah.
but also your organisation presenting a credible purpose
Yeah.
that is over and
Yeah.
above just making money for shareholders.
Now, I would have trouble, you know, as of today, saying that manufacturing and selling cigarettes was useful, because, you know, I'm not against people smoking, but I don't think it's a useful occupation. Some people would say, well, producing oil is just as bad because it's causing climate change. But it supplies vital energy. Yeah. I mean, the fact that you can see me is because the lights are on.
Absolutely. Mark, thank you very much indeed for a really great interview.